Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 111, The Unstopped Crises. Kant was a man of his word. Moreover, reoccupying the salt mines was the main strategy for the development of Oasis Lookout. Kant didn't want to see such a situation, allowing the defeated Jack Allen to regain their strength in the salt mines and tribal ruins. This would give them time to develop into a strong tribe again. Although the Naran Desert was vast, its resources were extremely scarce. Kant only allowed one force to survive and develop in this barren land, and that was himself. As for the lives of the Jack Allen, what did it have to do with him? After lunch and a short rest, assemble order was given. 20 Sarandian horsemen and 25 elite desert bandits were all present. They were waiting outside the east gate of the city. They were riding on horses and whispering to each other, with a sinister smile on their faces. It was obvious that they did not take this expedition too seriously. This group of Sarandian desert bandits had always been fearless. With Kant around, they did not have to worry about falling into danger because they underestimated the enemy. They were all desert bandits who licked blood on the blade. They always underestimating the enemy due to their unruly habits. Although life and death were up to fate, none of them really thought about it. With Kant leading them, they would only be more cautious. This time, clearing out the Jack Allens who had occupied the well and salt mine was just one of the tasks. It also included the coarse salt in the salt mine. They had to bring some back and boil a batch of it. Stone Pass did not had much patience to wait. "Are you ready?" Kant walked out of the city gate and looked at the 55 cavalries in front of him. He looked relaxed. Time did not wait for them. It would take a day to go from Oasis Lookout to the tribal ruins, not to mention that they had to go to the natural salt mines. It would take a long time to go back and forth, boil salt, and then lead the team to the Stone Pass. It would took a week. Phyrontis followed behind. When he heard the slight anxiety in Kant's voice, he said, "Everything is ready." This attack was arranged by him. After thinking for a while and confirming that there were no mistakes, he said with certainty, "The camels and supplies are also fully prepared. Once we reach the natural salt mine, we can directly mine the coarse salt and bring it back." "Well done," Kant nodded in satisfaction. Not far from these Sarandian people, 10 one-humped camels were standing there quietly. On the backs of the camels hung bulging gunny sacks. They were all food, water sack, and bags used to store coarse salt for this trip to the deep of the Naran Desert. All the things were taken care of by 10 peasants, and they were quite well prepared. The Swadian footman brought Kant's warhorse. Stepping on the stirrups, Kant nimbly got on the horse, pulled on his hood, and ordered, "Prepare to set off." Prepare to set off. When the Sarandian horsemen heard this, the leader of the group immediately shouted. The originally neat cavalry formation gradually dismissed. The Sarandian horse beneath them began to move its feet, breathing heavily. With the pull of the reins, it turned its head and slowly walked in the right direction. Phyrontis, on the other hand, took a few quick steps and said to Kant, "Lord, do we really not need to bring more people?" "No," Kant shook his head. Looking at the Swadian footmen standing by on the city wall, as well as the light footmen patrolling around the oasis, Kant's expression was more solemn as he said, "Your task is to defend the fortress. Communicate with Manat and assign your own areas of responsibility. I don't want to come back and find my own estate in a mess." "Understood, Lord Kant," Phyrontis said with a serious face. But he still looked worried. Phyrontis had patrolled the deep of the Naran Desert for many days. He clearly understood that even if the Jack Allen tribe was defeated, there were still had some small Jack Allen tribe that was scattered in the desert. "Don't worry," Kant noticed his worry and shook his head with a smile. He patted his side and said, "I still have this." It was a long rod-shaped object that was stored in a slender linen bag. It was as long as a lance or spear used by cavalry, but it was slightly bloated on the outside, as if it was wrapped in something. Intimidation. What Kant currently possessed could be said to be a divine artifact. Seeing the folded flag, Firentus' worried expression eased slightly, but he still reminded him, "Lord, fighting on the battlefield is very dangerous. If possible, please pay attention to your safety first before considering the outcome of the battle." "Yes, I will be careful," Kant nodded, shook the reins, and turned his horse and galloped. The horse's hooves stepped into the sand, leaving a shallow pit. The entire team began to speed up, heading deeper into the Naran desert. Time was tight, so they had to use their fastest speed to head to the tribal ruins. That was the only water source around. The Jack Allen who had been defeated and scattered would definitely regroup in the ruins. Although the group was not as large as before, and there was no Jack Allen shaman who had mastered a mysterious power, there were still quite a lot of ordinary Jack Lands. With the current 20 Sarandian horsemen and 25 elite desert bandits, even though they were light cavalry, it would not be a problem for them to directly charge into the formation of these ordinary Jack Allen and crushing them once again. There were 2 times when a bird was startled by a bow. Moreover, intimidation wasn't something to be trifled with. It could be used to weaken the spirit of the enemy by the first round. As their comrade kept dying, the spirits of the enemy continued to drop. They could kept reducing the spirit of the enemies for few more rounds until it became negative. How could they continued to put up a desperate struggle and fight Kant and the others to the death? This was simply impossible. The footprints and traces left by the expedition last month were still clearly visible. There was very little wind in the Naran desert, so the footprints and rut marks on the dune could not be removed unless there was a once-in-a-century sandstorm. Otherwise, the traces would be removed after the wind blow for a period. But it would take at least a few months. Therefore, Kant and the others did not worry that they moved in a wrong direction. Following the traces of the past, the team moved forward quickly. It was quiet on the way, and they did not meet too many Jack Allen. Normally, 30 to 40 Jack Allens would turned around and ran when they met Kant and the others. They looked panicked, obviously afraid of Kant and his light cavalry, and did not dare to fight against them. At first, Kant ordered to his men kill them. However, it was a waste of time and did not yield anything at all. Therefore, when they continued to move forward, they did not pay any attention to the small group of Jack Allen. Unless there were about 100 of them, which might cause some harm to the Oasis lookout. Kant would give the order brazenly and raised the flag of the Golden Lion with a red background. He would lead the team to crush them and slaughter them all in the desert to prevent future trouble. The speed of the troops was still very fast. Sarand horse and desert horse were both suitable horses for the desert. The single-humped camel was also known as the ship of the desert. Although its short-distance burst was not as good as that of the horses, it had better endurance which was suitable for long-term journey. This was the main factor to ensure the speed of progress. Fortunately, Kant's camel and warhorse did not cause any accidents. According to the experience of his previous life, horses were extremely sensitive to the smell of camels and would be very afraid of them. On the other hand, camels would be irritable towards horses. If the two were put together, it would probably be a chaotic situation. This was also why the camel cavalry was the absolute nemesis of the warhorse cavalry. This was precisely the reason. However, this kind of troop class could only appear in the desert. After all, in flat grasslands or other plains regions, the highly mobile warhorse cavalry was not afraid of the slow-moving camel cavalry. However, in the desert, the camel cavalry was extremely powerful. This had once been shown in the deserts of some regions on Earth. Historically, the Arabs rode camels and defeated the elite warhorse cavalry of countless empires in the desert, including the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. To be honest, Kant was quite interested in this. However, thinking that there were no standard camel cavalry in the current cavalry, he could only choose to give up. The troops moved very fast. They rested at dusk and prepared dinner. After nightfall, they continued to set off and did not sleep until late at night. They traveled at dawn and soon approached the tribal ruins. From the Oasis lookout to the ruins of the Jack Allen tribe, the cavalry could arrive in just 1 day. Even if there were footmen accompanying them, 2 days was enough. The distance was not too far. Kant rode his horse up the dune, followed by 10 Sarandian horsemen as his guards. There are no sentries. These Sarandian horsemen, who belonged to the standard army, reported. Kant snorted, "It seems that these Jack Allen think that we will let them go. They did not even have sentries. They were really bold." He stared at the bottom of the dune. On the originally flat desert, there was still a large area that was pitch black due to the fire. There were ruins everywhere, and there were ashes everywhere. However, in the ruins, there were also tattered tents. Wait, that is. Kant narrowed his eyes. He discovered something unusual. Among these tattered linen tents, there were more than 10 tents made of brand new linen. Even when Kant's eyes glanced over them, these brand new tents had a clear demarcation line with the other tattered tents. It was just like the Chu River and Han border. Although they were close, the two did not cross paths at all. Even the Jack Allen in those simple tents did not dare to come close. It was as if there was some kind of great terror. Kant was not surprised by this. Because he had already discovered that the people who appeared in these brand new tents were Jack Allen in mail armor and holding two-handed battle axes. Their fur was clean and neat. They were definitely not low-level Jack Allen who lived in the desert. "High-level Jack Allens, is they coming again?" he said slowly. Chapter 112, The Invincible Charge. Tidy hair, strong and sturdy body, bright eyes, thick and powerful arms. These were the characteristics of the high-level Jack Allen who had built the kingdom of Greymane on the Mannheim coast. These were the characteristics of civilized people, civilized races, and people who knew modesty and etiquette. Kant's eyes told him the truth. The forces of the kingdom of Greymane, who had once been in an unknown location, did not know where they were, and did not know when they would arrive, had already spread their forces to the south side of the Naran Desert, carefully exploring this place. Damn it! Kant squinted his eyes, lowered his head, and cursed softly. Those 10 or so brand new tents were enough to foretold that the crisis had come again. Without the merchants, Asaj, they still managed to reach this place based on the map and route map they had obtained. They had also contacted the Jack Allen that had been defeated previously and settled down here once more, establishing the foundation of the outpost base. After thinking about it carefully, Kant was certain that when the expedition army had arrived, it would be the time to attack the Oasis lookout. "My lord." The Sarandian horseman beside him spoke with a heavy tone, "Do we need to be ready for battle?" "Yes," Kant's eyes were gloomy. "I mean, right now." "Understood," the light cavalry behind them nodded silently. They packed their weapons, tidied up their armor, and continued to wait for Kant's orders. They gripped their spears and scimitars, ready for battle. The slaughter would continue. This was a war for survival. Kant would not allow the kingdom of Greymane to occupy the Oasis lookout and then attack the dukedom of Leo. It was not simply the responsibility of the Baron of the Naran Desert and as a noble of the dukedom of Leo. It was not for his father, Cameron the Grand Duke of Leo either. It was for himself. Losing the Oasis lookout was equivalent to losing the Naran Desert. Losing the Naran Desert was equivalent to losing his fiefdom. Losing his fiefdom was equivalent to losing his noble title. Losing his noble title meant that his life had come to an end. The gallows would eventually appear before Kant's eyes. Within the dukedom of Leo, the noble forces who had been glaring at him with hatred would personally place the gallows on Kant's neck and pull the trigger, let the suffocated corpses to sway like a pendulum. Kant's expression returned to calm, but there was a thick haze in his eyes. This was the consequence of losing the Oasis lookout. It must be impossible. His chest heaved up and down as Kant picked up the flag that was wrapped in a special long bag. He turned his head to look at the Sarandian light cavalries who were ready behind him. Their faces looked serious and excited. He said in a deep voice, "Come, my cavalry. Let our friends know who is the true master of the Naran Desert." The flag made of velvet was pulled out, and a golden lion with red background instantly began to flutter in the wind. Intimidation, activate. Everyone charge. Kant shook the reins with one hand and roared as he took the lead. Charge. Behind him, 20 Sarandian horsemen and 25 elite desert bandits also roared as they shook the reins. A straight spear was clamped under their armpits. As the warhorse charged in high speed, they quickly passed Kant and formed a cone formation to protect him in the middle. The cone formation was the most famous formation of the cavalry in the era of cold weapons. It was like a sharp arrow, and also like a long awl. The 20 Sarandian horsemen who were fully armored were a assault team, while the 25 elite desert bandits who were holding spears were the main force. Without the slow movement speed of the footmen, the entire cavalry ferociously pounced down the dune, piercing into the enemy's body with their sharp blades, completely tearing apart the enemy cavalries and their attempts to resist. Before the enemy could even react, they were crushed. Rumbling. The sound of rolling thunder was incessant. It was weird to hear a thunder in this dry desert. Those high-level Jack Allen who were used to the warm climate of the Mannheim coast walked out of their tents and looked up at the sky in surprise. However, the expected thick dark clouds, rolling thunder, and heavy rain did not appear. This made them very shocked since they came to the southern part of the Naran desert. The high temperature and desolation of the desert almost driven them mad. It's not a heavy rain. Some high-level Jack Allens asked in their language. However, their companions were confused and doubtful to answer, and they had anxiety due to the high temperature. They did not saw the fear and anxiety on the faces of the low-level Jackalanks in the tattered tents beside them. With their higher status, they had always looked down at the low-level Jackalans. They would not pay attention to their uncivilized sibling at all, despite the low-level Jack Allens had become very frightened and nervous. The tremors under their feet were getting stronger and stronger. The rolling thunder was also getting clearer and clearer in their ears. It even made them subconsciously think of the continuous muffled thunder when a storm appeared on the Sea of Stars. The Kingdom of Greymane did not have many overseas trade and port to begin with. Unfortunately, because the private boats of the lizardmen and the sea patrolling of the Elven Parliament became more and more strict, they had basically lost all the possibility of sailing on their own. They could no longer see the Sea of Stars. The storm that terrified countless captains and sailors came from the supreme power of the Storm Monarch. Roar! The panicked howls of the low-level Jack Allens broke their thoughts. These high-level Jack Allens turned their heads in confusion. The tremors under their feet became more and more intense, and the sounds coming from their ears became louder and louder, so much so that they even felt that something was wrong. They turned their heads in shock to see dozens of figures rushing down from the dune, and their confused eyes instantly shrank. They finally realized what the rolling thunder was: the cavalry of the human race. A rare troop class on the coast of Mannheim. The only ones that were similar to them were the Moondeer Bow cavalry of the elf race. However, they had never seen heavily armored humans. They rode their horses with their spears and rushed over like a flood that had broken the dam, wanting to crush them into pieces. Awoo, awoo! The low-level Jackalans' terrified cries could be heard. There were even Jack Allens who turned around and fled. They had lost the confidence to continue fighting. This made the high-level Jack Allens who were still stunned to come back to their senses. All of them gathered together with solemn expressions. They held their battle axes in both hands tightly. This heavy weapon made them feel confident in their hearts. They were not those ignorant and uncivilized low-level Jack Allens. Looking at the charging speed of the human cavalry, they knew that they could not run far with their own legs. They could only fight back. With their sturdy and strong bodies, the strongest melee race in Mannheim coast, how could the high-level Jack Allen warriors with two-handed battle axes lose to those weak humans? Even if they were riding on horses, these strong Jack Allen warriors only looked ferocious and fearless. In a head-on fight, they had never been afraid of anyone. However, the human cavalry was getting closer and closer, and the rolling sound of thunder swept through their minds. They felt the faint tremors became stronger and stronger under the sand they tampered on, and even their feet could feel the violent tremors. This caused them to lose their courage for some unknown reason. The hearts of the 30 over Jack Allen soldiers, who were holding onto their battle axes, wearing mail armor and linen robe, were beating fast. Their mouths were dry and their tongues were parched. They felt a strong urge to urinate in their stomachs. As they watched the human cavalry approaching, their figure becoming clearer and clearer, and even seeing the red flag in their hands, the high-level Jack Allen soldiers felt ashamed of themselves of being cowardly. However, they couldn't change anything. The human cavalry became faster and faster, and the rumbling thunder became louder and louder, and the vibrations became more and more intense. The 3-meter-long spear approached closer and closer. Finally, the two sides came into contact. The spear pierced through the chest of the Jack Allen. Their seemingly sturdy mail armor couldn't block the sharp spear, and it pierced through the back of the Jack Allen easily. Along with the irresistible force of inertia, the spear continued to pierce into the chest of the another high-level Jack Allen at the back, pushing them to retreat. They looked at front of them in despair, unable to retaliate at all. The spear that pierced through them in an instant also took away all their strength. They that had been invincible in the Mannheim coast, yet they could not even held the two-handed battle axe and could only let it fall to the ground. The horses neighed in their ears. These Jack Allens could even see the human faces on the horses. Indifference, coldness, and undisguised disdain in their eyes. Because they could not fight back at all. Because their bodies were continuing to step back. Because all of their chests were strung up by long spears, they were pushed and knocked by the human cavalry. They retreated helplessly, and did not have any strength to fight back. They even no longer held their weapons, and they fell to the ground shamefully. Ka-cha 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 ka-cha. A series of crisp sounds appeared. The long spears hooked by the Jack Allen sent them flying for a few meters. Finally, due to the instant blast and inertia, these refined military spears could no longer withstand the force and weight, and they broke apart with ka-cha. However, the horsemen were already prepared. They were all well-trained and the most elite cavalry. Without hesitation, they abandoned the broken spear and urged their horses to knock away the Jack Allens that had been strung together. They continued to rush towards the open space behind them and slowed down. They turned their horses around and stretched out their hands to pull out the scimitars on their waists. Once they were ready to charge again, the cavalries tightened their reins and stood still. Because of their charge, the regrouped high-level Jack Allen had all been wiped out. They fell to the ground miserably. The broken spear pierced into their chests, and fresh blood dyed the sand red. No one could stood up. And no one could survived. The leading high-level Jack Allen struggled to turn its head, and used its last bit of strength to look at the human cavalries with scimitars in their hands. Its eyes were filled with extreme fear and disbelief. This the human's cavalry? It slowly opened its mouth, but the blood gushing out of its throat was unable to make it say a single word. However, fear was in its mind. This was completely different from the human sailors they met on the Sea of Stars or in the port of the Mannheim coast. Those humans might be a little cunning, but they were not powerful. There were no such warriors on horseback on the merchant ships. When they were being blackmailed by the Jack Allen officials, they would only smile. Even if they encountered Jack Allen pirates, they would at most wave their long sword to resist. They definitely had never encountered such a brazen and almost invincible charge. No, impossible. The heart that had been pierced and destroyed by the spearhead could no longer supply blood, causing its brain to start suffocating. Its eyes had also lost sight, and it could only laid on the sand. This was very uncomfortable, but it could not did anything anymore. A thought suddenly appeared in its final consciousness, and that was that the kingdom of Greymane had used up all its strength to put together an expedition army that would set off in a month's time. It seemed to be in great danger. Chapter 113, Orders to Destroy the Well. Whoa! Kant tightened his grip on the reins, and his warhorse finally slowed down as he moved forward. The Sarandian horsemen and the desert bandits beside him also slowed down their horses and gathered around Kant. Some of them held their machetes tightly in their trembling right hands, and their expressions were extremely cold. They had just experienced a battle, and the enemies who dared to block them were crushed. Even now, these bandits from the Sarandian desert were in disbelief. They didn't understand why these Jack Allen heavy infantrymen were so confident that they dared to face the spear of the cavalry head-on when the cavalry was charging at its maximum speed. If they spread out, they wouldn't be annihilated in the first round of charging. That was why Kant's men's right hands were trembling. It wasn't because they were excited, nor was it because they were afraid. It was because of the reaction force when they came into contact with the Jack Allen's heavy infantrymen during the charge. It caused their right hand and arm, which had been well trained, to suffer a considerable impact. It would probably take 2 to 3 days for them to fully recover. They could continue charging at such a large scale and intensity, but their arms would suffer irreversible damages. Fortunately, the battle had already ended. "It's over." Kant's voice sounded with a hint of fatigue. They had traveled all the way here and had to go into battle before they had time to rest. Most of their energy was used up. The 30 or so Jack Allen that dared to resist were killed on the spot. The 300 low-level Jack Allen around them fled in great disorder. They didn't even dare to resist before vanishing into the vast sea of sand around them. They seemed to have suffered severe psychological trauma, so they couldn't organize a counterattack in a short time. In fact, no Jack Allen organized a counterattack. No one would go on a suicide mission, even the savage, and uncivilized lower-level Jack Allen. They all knew fear. "Lord Kant, do we still need to chase after them?" The Sarandian horseman beside him spoke. The surrounding Sarandian horsemen were also eager to give it a try. Their eyes swept across the dunes around them and were gleaming with undisguised excitement and obvious intention to kill because they felt that they had reached a critical point. A quantitative change would cause a qualitative change. This was considered the critical point of rebirth. However, Kant rejected their request to pursue. "There's no need." Slowly letting out a breath, Kant ordered in a deep voice, "Let our caravan come over. Let's rest here and set up a temporary camp. Those fleeing Jack Allens could never outrun our warhorse. I don't want any accidents to happen." "Understood." An elite desert bandit nodded and immediately rode his horse towards the dune where they were charging from. When they charged, they left behind the caravan and the peasants. The single-humped camels loaded with supplies and the peasants holding a long scythe were not the valiant and invincible cavalry on the battlefield. They could not even fight the low-level Jack Allens holding a spiked club, not to mention the high-level Jack Allen warriors. Kant no longer needed the low-level infantrymen to risk their lives for the future. These Sarandian light cavalrymen were enough to deal with most of the problems. Soon, the 10 peasants hiding behind the dune carried long scythe in their arms and led the 10 single-humped camels down the dunes. Joy was written all over their faces. They knew about the victory of this battle. "Set up the tents." Kant looked at the empty space around them. At the same time, he gave detailed instructions, "Go and check the well out. I hope there's no problem." "Understood." The accompanying peasants immediately took action. The elite desert bandits also dismounted and helped setting up the tents. At the same time, they also found some temporary stoves and started to prepare food. They had not eaten breakfast yet and were starving. The Sarandian horsemen were responsible for cleaning the battlefield. Even without Kant's arrangement, they could still do their jobs in an orderly manner. The tent was set up. The sand pit inside was done. The old tent was set on fire. With the addition of the wood they brought, the temporary grill was officially completed. Slices of bread, dried meat, and dried sausage were placed beside the bonfire to be heated up. Together with a few date palms, breakfast was ready. Of course, everyone also had a piece of date honey sweet, which had just been made successfully yesterday. The delicious and sweet taste filled their mouths, and the soldiers, who were used to eating salty and hard dried meat, were very satisfied. There was also cool well water from the well, which was used by the soldiers, who had traveled for a long time, to clean themselves up and to scrub their bodies. With this kind of leisure, it did not feel like a war, but more like an outing. This was the treatment of a victor. After breakfast, Kant also washed up a little. The cold well water was applied on his face and body with a towel. The tiredness from last night's journey seemed to have been washed away, and after this enjoyable battle, he became energetic. He walked toward the well nearby. The edge of the well was blackened by the fire, but the water wheel that was burned had been replaced with a new one. It seemed to be changed by the high-level Jack Allens. The water was not only needed to keep their bodies hydrated but also to wash their body hair. Compared to the low-level Jack Allens who didn't know what etiquette was, these high-level Jack Allens cared more about their appearance. "Lord, we can't keep this well," the Sarandian horseman behind Kant said with a solemn tone. "This will become the enemy's aid." "That's right," Kant nodded. The high-level Jack Allens had appeared here again. Azaj, the captive, said that the expeditionary army would soon appear in the south of the Naran Desert, and this well would be their first stop. It would probably take 30 days to cross the edge of the Devil's Land that had no water or vegetation. Even if they brought a large number of supplies, those would probably be used up when they were here. The expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane would urgently need to replenish their water supply. This well was 2 meters in diameter and was directly connected to the underground water. The well that was once able to meet the needs of close to 2,000 Jack Allens would be a life-saving straw to them. It would also be the greatest help in conquering the Oasis lookout. Oasis lookout was the most suitable outpost, and those Jack Allen definitely wouldn't give up. "I must destroy this well." Kant made up his mind. He could have the caravan bring more water sack to solve the drinking water problem, but he wasn't willing to let this well become the enemy's supply station. Leaving the well would be irresponsible and would lead to the most serious consequences. Fortunately, they discovered it in time and sensed that the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane was coming. They only needed to dig up the edge of the well and pour a lot of sand into it. They could level the well with the surrounding ground, and no one would see any traces of it. And if Kant won the battle in the future, or if he wanted to continue to develop this place, he only needed to look for the well carefully. The walls of the well were already made. By then, they only needed to dig along the stone walls of the well and dig up the sand again. This well, which was connected to the underground water, would continue to exist in the desert and become Kant's aid. Of course, only Kant knew about this. Those low-level Jack Allens could not tell the exact location of the well. This would make the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane, who reached the southern part of the Naran Desert after a long journey, helpless. They would continue to advance toward the Oasis lookout with their exhausted bodies. Eventually, they would be destroyed by the desert, and Kant's victory would be achieved. They did as they were told. The peasants and cavalrymen who had finished their breakfast came over to help. After replenishing their sacks with the well water, they started to cover the well up. It did not take much effort to fill a well in the desert. The amount of sand on the surrounding dunes was immeasurable. Sacks of sand were poured into the well and blocked the bottom of the well. This was not a small project. They worked from the morning until noon. After resting, they continued to work. When it was almost afternoon, more than 60 people finally completely filled the well with sand. They even tore down the stones that formed the wall of the well and threw them inside. They continued to fill the well with sand until the place was completely flattened and no traces of the well could be seen. They continued to rest. After eating dinner, Kant ordered, "Let's go." They had other important matters to attend to after a busy day. They still needed to clean up the Jack Allens in the natural salt mine. The linen sacks carried by the 10 one-humped camels had to be filled up with coarse salt, and only then was their mission accomplished. Taking advantage of the dusk, they continued to move forward in the desert. As the stars appeared, the coldness had already penetrated through their clothes. It was unbearable. After they had traveled nearly half the distance, Kant ordered them to set up camp. They didn't know if there were still Jack Allens at the natural salt mine, or if there would be more high-level Jack Allens. Therefore, it was critical to maintain their energy and physical strength on their way to the salt mine was. Nothing happened during the night. They woke up early the next morning. After breakfast, they went on with their journey and soon arrived at the salt mine in the morning. In the vast desert, the white salt and alkaline land spread to the horizon. These were all precious resources formed after the salt lake dried up. Kant looked around and didn't find any Jack Allen. However, the tents they destroyed the last time they came and the bodies of the Jack Allens had disappeared. The exact situation was unknown. However, according to Kant's understanding of the Jack Allen that lived in the desert, when they were hungry, even their own kind would be listed on their menu. So, they would not care at all about eating corpses. Peasants, collect the coarse salt. Hurry up! Kant turned his head and ordered. At the same time, he said in a deep voice, Sarandian horsemen, stand by. Desert bandits, spread out and scout. Understood. Everyone replied. Kant had less and less time left. He needed to improve his strength as fast as possible. Kant was not confident about relying entirely on the protection of the current Oasis lookout when the expeditionary army from the Kingdom of Greymane arrived. After all, he did not know how many troops there would be. However, since these troops could carry out expeditions, they would definitely be in large numbers and would not be too weak. Chapter 114, The Tragic Fate After Defeat. The expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane was like the sword of Damocles hanging above Kant's head. It would appear anytime, putting him in the most dangerous situation. One wrong step and he would be in the abyss of eternal damnation. Time was not on Kant's side because he did not have the initiative and could only passively accept it. This was undoubtedly the reason that made Kant the most anxious he had ever been. He had not become the strongest. To the enemy, Kant's Oasis lookout and the Trondheim that had changed from a village to a fortress, was still weak. Even if he had the power to fight back, it was still not enough to make the enemy worry. This was contempt, confidence in their own strength, and they were underestimating Kant. And to Kant, this might be the enemy's flaw. He must return to Oasis lookout as soon as possible and try to be fully prepared. The experience gained from this attack and the coarse salt that he brought back could all become Kant's strength in the shortest amount of time, preparing him for the next battle. After the small battles along the way and the battle at the tribal ruins, the original 5 Sarandian horsemen were already very well prepared and could be upgraded to Kant's another Class 5 troop at any time. This type of heavy cavalry was as good as the Swadian Knight in the original version, which was the king in the desert, the Mamluk. Kant's only Class 5 troop was different from the Class 5 Raven Turn Rangers. As archers, they only had a supporting role in the war. On the other hand, these heavy cavalry, which was the strongest in the desert, were the true force that could charge into the enemy's formation. They were invincible and could tear apart the enemy's troops and destroy them. They were the symbol of true power. Although there were only 5 of them, they were like the sharpest blades among the longswords. This was because they had already become the most crucial and terrifying weapon. These 5 Mamluks led Kant's current 50 Swadian heavy cavalrymen, as well as the 15 Sarandian horsemen, 25 elite desert bandits, and perhaps the 20 desert bandits who could be recruited every week in the future. This was like breaking the surface through a single point. A cavalry of fewer than 100 people was enough to crush an army of more than 1,000 people from the front and directly cut it into halves. Moreover, with the experience of the others, their power was likely to reach its peak. Before the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane arrived, Kant would have this Sarandian cavalry clear the desert. They would intercept and kill small groups of Jack Allens. It would also help them obtain a large amount of experience as soon as possible and finally go to a higher level. The Sarandian horsemen and elite desert bandits were both light cavalry. There was no need to worry about the Swadian heavy cavalry. Although they were a Class 4 troop, they could not go deep into the desert to fight alone, but as long as they brought enough food and water, they could fight everywhere. Therefore, what Kant lacked was time. What a pity! He frowned and sighed in his heart. The power is not in my hands. While he was thinking, a Sarandian horseman quickly came over and reported, "Lord, everything has been collected." That was quick. Kant nodded and praised. On the salt-alkali land not far away, the peasant used tools to collect the coarse salt that could be taken anywhere. All of it was packed in sacks and carefully tied up. They were placed on the backs of the 10 one-humped camels that came with them. The bulging sacks were filled with coarse salt and were put on the camels steadily. They looked heavy, but to these camels, who were used to carrying things, they were nothing out of the ordinary. Back then, the Arabic merchants relied on these one-humped camels, known as the ship of the desert, to form a large-scale caravan. They crossed the vast desert and harsh desert, selling goods from the east and the west. The profits were quite substantial. Inform the surrounding desert bandits. Kant opened his mouth and instructed the Sarandian horseman beside him, "We are preparing to return." Understood. The Sarandian horseman nodded and immediately rode off. The elite desert bandits had already spread out, forming a 5-man team to repeatedly scout the surroundings. They were either holding machetes to chase after and kill the small groups of jack-allans who thought that they were lucky and stayed nearby. While ensuring the caravan's safety, it also happened to increase their battle merits. Of course, these battle merits were what Kant understood as a battle experience. No one would be willing to accept the status quo. They were all living people with their own ideas. Becoming a powerful and respected top-class troop was their lifelong pursuit. Of course, they were willing to work hard. Moreover, they all saw their hope. In this miracle land, under the leadership of Lord Kant, there were already seniors who were about to become the Mamluk. This was a goal that every Sarandian soldier was after. Harumph! The desert horses beneath them snorted, and the elite desert bandits that had dispersed gradually retreated. However, they weren't fast. Because beside them, jack-allans with their heads lowered were walking side by side. Their bodies were covered in tattered animal skin and linen, and the spiked club that was in their hands had disappeared. It seemed that these low-level jack-allans had been captured. They even let go of their weapons and chose to surrender. They returned to the salt mine. Kant looked at the prisoners. There were close to 300 low-level jack-allans. He was also stunned. Turning his head to look at the elite desert bandits, he could not help but shake his head and laugh. He asked, "This really puzzled me. Why did you bring back so many captives when you went out to investigate?" And these jack-allans actually obediently surrendered. In fact, Lord, as you can see. These elite desert bandits shrugged and said helplessly at the same time, "They really surrendered." The Sarandian horsemen were standing guard at the side. Although their spears were broken during the charge, the shiny elite scimitars were tightly held in their hands as they were vigilantly watching those dirty and sloppy low-level jack-allan. If there were any unusual movements, they would just barge in and kill them. Even Kant found it hard to believe, not to mention the others, that these uncivilized, savage low-level jack-allans actually chose to surrender to them. Just like it was theoretically impossible for Kant and his Oasis lookout to surrender to the expeditionary army of the Kingdom of Greymane and the high-level jack-allans from the Mannheim coast. They were not of the same race. They were even hostile races who fought for the hegemony of the desert and survival. There was not much difference between surrender and death. The final result was still the same. Death. It was just a matter of time. If they resisted, they would still have a small chance of surviving. But once they surrendered, how could Kant let them go? Kant snorted and stretched out his hand to instruct the elite desert bandits, "Since they have chosen to surrender, bring all of them back." The mine owners of the Snowfield iron mines in the kingdom of Viagirs were never short of dinar. Leniency? It did not exist for Kant. Which race and which power would be lenient and let their enemies go when they were on the rise? It was just like an ancient country that had developed since ancient times. It had almost occupied half of Asia, and its enemies had been reduced to ashes one by one. Could it be that these territories were all given to it as a reward? What a joke! Being merciful to his enemies was being cruel to himself. Kant preferred to eradicate the roots of the problem. Yes, my lord. The elite desert bandits responded, but their actions were not polite at all. They pulled out their scabbards that were hanging on their waists and slapped the back of these low-level jackallans' heads or cheeks. Those jackallans, who had lost their morale and wildness, quickly gathered together. Some people brought hemp ropes to tie up the jackallans' hands and feet. Although they were jackallans, they looked no different from 300 dogs. Kant looked at these jackallans coldly. He felt extremely complicated. The losers of the battle were so miserable. Only the winners had the right to be arrogant. If he didn't want to be like the losers, other than winning the difficult battles, he needed to become stronger. Let's go. Kant got on the horse, turned around, and left. Let's go. The elite desert bandits also yelled. They used the scabbard in their hands to hit the faces of the slower jackallans. Some used too much strength and the jackallans were badly mutilated. Even a few of their teeth were knocked out. But so what? The jackallans who had chosen to surrender and become captives didn't have the slightest bit of courage and savagery that they used to have. Although they were generally more like animals than humans, under the threat of death, they behaved more rationally. Since they had surrendered, they did not want to die. The whole team began to turn back. Their speed was not fast because of the load on the caravan and the jackallan captives. They still ate their meals on time, set off at dawn, rested at noon, traveled in the evening, and slept at night. Their schedules were very regular. There were no longer any jackallans in the tribal ruins that had been destroyed by Kant. After losing the well, this place had lost its value of existence. In the vast desert sea, there might be oases with other water sources, but they were extremely rare. It was extremely difficult for these low-level jackallans to find them, and even if they found them, they wouldn't be able to support too many jackallans. The Naran Desert was known as a desert for civilizations, a forbidden area for other races. It didn't exist in the poems that the poets sang but in the lessons of blood and tears. The days of these low-level jackallans, even if they were patient, became more and more miserable. Of course, Kant did not care. It would be better if all these jackallans died in the desert so that he would not have to go back again in the future to eliminate them. 2 days and 2 nights passed. The troops led by Kant finally returned to the Oasis lookout. They had tons of coarse salt but were short of water and food. The 300 jackallan captives could not even walk properly anymore. Chapter 115, Rich Battle Returns. The Ravenstern Ranger on the top floor had already seen Kant. Before they reached the city gate, Phyrontus had already brought the Swadian heavy cavalry to welcome them. The 50 heavy cavalry soldiers who were on standby, including their horses, were all heavily armored, even though they were covered in a layer of linen to block the scorching heat from the chain mail. The hooves of their horses shook the sand layer. Every step they took caused sand to splash out, leaving behind shallow holes. It looked truly terrifying. They were known as the Class 4 cavalry with the best defensive measure and were the strongest in a group battle. This reputation was there for a reason. Lord Kant, welcome back in triumph. Under the leadership of Phyrontus, everyone bowed respectfully to Kant. Although Kant was tired, he still tried to cheer up and nodded. From the start of the journey to the salt mine, he had experienced battles and spent 2 days and 2 nights to return. It was indeed an extremely arduous journey. Kant turned his head to look at the afternoon sun. The day was approaching dusk. Although the sun was not as hot as it was at noon, it still made him sweat profusely. Kant waved his hand and instructed, "Quickly prepare some food and water. Don't forget to give some fresh grass for the warhorse." "Lord, everything has been prepared," Phyrontus replied. He was always very well prepared. "Very good." Kant was satisfied. "This is my job." Phyrontus bowed his head respectfully. His excellent manners stopped him from being arrogant. At the same time, he turned his head and looked at the low-level jack-allans that were tied together. They were skin and bones. He frowned and said with a slightly apologetic tone, "Lord, I didn't know that there were so many captives. Therefore, their food and water can only be prepared after they are in the fortress." "Don't worry about it," Kant replied. These jack-allans were very tenacious. They wouldn't die in a short time. To be on the safe side, the food and water that Kant only gave very little of food and water to these captives during the 2 days and 2 nights of the return journey. That could only satisfy their basic needs. They couldn't be full and energetic. They were escorted back to the Oasis lookout. Manad, the merchant leader, and the infantrymen who were stationed at the city gate also came and waited respectfully. As for the busy peasant, when they heard that their lord had returned in triumph, they all dropped their work and rushed to the city gate. They stood behind the soldiers and cheered to welcome him. Kant rode his horse into the fortress. There was a smile on his face. Although this was just a formality, his soldiers and the peasants were celebrating his return from the bottom of their hearts. Vanity immediately filled his chest. He was kind of drunk on pride. Kant sighed in his heart, "No wonder all those who are in power like to be welcomed. This feels really great." He did not only feel special. The explosion of vanity in his mind could make him lose his head. It turned the once astute monarch into a muddle head and the general who was good at fighting into a big head. Many people were destroyed by vanity. Kant understood that and calmed down very quickly. It was not because he was very rational. It was the current situation of Trondheim that sobered him up instantly. There were not enough military buildings, the city walls were not high, there were no arrow towers, sentry towers, belfries, or weapons workshops. There was not even a military camp where soldiers can rest. At night, they could only sleep in tents that were lit by bonfires. There were not enough houses. The few houses could only accommodate 50 peasant women. The other 200 peasant women also had to sleep in tents. From the outside, it looked like the Oasis lookout was surrounded by the city walls, the soldiers were standing guard, and everything was in good order. However, in reality, the most backward northern territory in the Dukedom of Leo, the most remote stone pass, had a much better environment than here. He got off the horse, and a Swadian infantryman immediately came over and took the reins. Kant also instructed, "Feed more water." "Understood," the infantryman nodded and led the warhorse to the temporary stables. The warhorses that travelled with them could not compare with camels. Camels were known as the boats of the desert, and they were fed with enough food and water before the journey. They would be fine if they did not eat or drink for 2 days. Warhorses were more delicate and could not do that. During this 3-day journey, Kant, the new military horse that had been meticulously nurtured in the kingdom of Swadia, had slimmed down. It had lost its spirit from before the journey. It was obvious that this trip in the desert had exhausted it. The Sarandian horses of the Sarandian horsemen and the elite desert bandits' desert horses were also quite tired. Trekking in the desert consumed 3 times more physical strength than trekking in the plains. Pulling the feet out of the soft sand layer would consume physical strength, and every step was tiring. Compared to the stone or dirt roads on the plains, the sand was harder to deal with. This was another reason why the camel-riding cavalry in the desert was stronger than the cavalry with war horses. Back at the council hall. After Kant sat down, the peasant men and women who served as servants quickly brought him all kinds of food. But it was still the same. Stewed mutton, roasted bread, roasted sausage, cabbage soup. But to Kant's surprise, there was also a layer of reddish-brown syrup on the toast, which seemed to be melted date honey sugar cubes. It tasted crisp and sweet, and together with the mutton that was also stewed with the sugar cubes, it was even more delicious. This was not a bad cuisine. After getting used to eating the salty and hard roasted dried meat and roasted sausage, these sweet foods were even more appetizing. It was just that the quantity was a little small. Just like the dishes at the king's banquet, they were famous for their delicateness and small portion. Kant finished these sweet foods in 2 or 3 bites, but his stomach was still rumbling. He shook his head helplessly and asked the peasant women waiting beside him, "Is there any other food?" "Yes." A smile soon decorated the peasant women's chubby faces, "It's being prepared in the kitchen." "Then hurry up and serve the dishes." Kant nodded and urged. These were the 50 peasant women from the kingdom of Swadia. All of them were around 30 years old, just like the peasant men. They were quite healthy, strong, and had no problem going to the fields. The standard Swadian women were not those delicate girls from the city. They were useless apart from being good-looking. Soon, the following dishes were served. The peasant woman twisted her waist that was as thick as a water bucket, her 2 strong legs were moving extremely fast. On her arms, which were comparable to Kant's thighs, she carried a tray and walked over to serve the food. There were 2 silver plates. "Lord, this is the fried fresh fillet of antelope and fried eggs." With a smile on her fat face, the peasant woman said proudly, "My lord, I made them myself." "Oh, very good." Kant lowered his head, picked up the knife and fork, and ate them silently. The taste was not bad. The fried fillet was sprinkled with a little spice and salt, and the heat used for frying was just nice. It was also served with a sauce made of honey and cabbage. The combination was perfect. Compared to the time when it was either roasted or stewed, the taste had gone up a level. The fried egg next to it was the same. Although it was an ordinary poached egg, it was as good as a delicacy for Kant. The peasant women and men were still waiting for him. Kant ate quickly, enjoying the relaxation and satisfaction of being home. The delicious food brought a pleasant feeling to his mind, he couldn't help but let his thoughts run wild. If this was a novel, perhaps those readers who had been looking forward to getting married would like these peasant women very much. If they married those women, not only could they have sex, but they would also have help with the housework. The peasant women could even pick up a kitchen knife and be their husbands' bodyguards, protecting them from bullies. Those who don't have a girlfriend will definitely like them, Kant thought silently. After finishing the food quickly, Kant let out a breath in satisfaction. These fried foods were much better than the coarse roasted food. The peasant woman next to him also thoughtfully brought him a cup of hot water that was boiled with date palm powder. This was an after-meal drink, and it could also be treated as tea. The date palm flavor was very strong, and the taste was good. Compared to those clumsy peasant men, the peasant women were better at serving people. The fatigue from the journey was slightly alleviated. Kant wiped the corner of his mouth with a handkerchief and ordered, "Clean it up." "Yes, my lord." The peasant women walked over and immediately started to put away the plates, they would take them out for cleaning. Meanwhile, Kant stood up and walked out of the council hall. The aroma of the food outside was very strong. On the street, tables and chairs were put together and piled up with food. The Sarandian people were eating happily. Obviously, the lamb cooked with oil was more delicious than the roasted dried meat and dried sausage. They had eaten enough of those along the way. Manad's arrangement was also very proper. When Kant walked out, the leader of the trade caravan hurried over to greet him. "I hope the food is to your liking." "Very good." Kant nodded in satisfaction. "The fried food is very good." The oil must have been purchased by the leader of the trade caravan. After all, only his trade caravan had this kind of material. As if he was reading Kant's mind, the leader of the trade caravan smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Lord, Mr. Manad didn't buy the oil from me. He only bought a large amount of grain and linen." "Hey!" Kant was curious. "Those sand gazelle are very fat. It's goat oil extracted from fat." Manad smiled and replied, "Although it has a little smell of mutton, after being covered by honey and spices, the fried food tastes pretty good. It's much better than simple baked food." "Well done." Kant couldn't help but praise. The price of a can of oil in the trade caravan was 500 dinars. This was the oil that was refined from the fattest slaughtered pigs in the continent of Karadia. Even Kant thought that it was expensive. That amount of money just to improve the food made his heart ache. After all, the weekly maintenance fee for 50 desert bandits was only 800 dinars. Of course, Kant was not short of money now. He turned to the trade caravan leader and smiled, "I have more than 300 Jack Allen captives here. I can't wait to have those lovely dinars reappear in my hands." Chapter 116, Thoughts about Slave Hunters. To Kant, the Jack Allen captives that were worth 30 dinars each were the fastest way to get more dinars at the moment, because as long as he wanted, countless Jack Allen tribes were waiting for him in the Naran Desert or the Sinway Range. This was also the reason why he never worried about money ever since he discovered that Jack Allen could be sold as captives. "It's my honor to be able to help you solve your problems." With a smile on his face, the leader of the trade caravan lowered his head and complimented him. Jack Allen captives were the most popular commodity in the kingdom of Viagiers. The owners of the snowfield mines loved them. Although they ate a lot, most of them seemed to be honest and willing to work. One Jack Allen was equal to 5 ordinary human miners. They were very cost-effective. Therefore, he asked the peasant who worked as a servant in the council hall to summon a guard in his trade caravan. Soon, the door of the council hall was opened. A young man wearing a linen robe, who looked energetic and capable, walked in. He stood in front of the table and bowed respectfully. He put his hand on his chest, and said earnestly, "Good afternoon, the great Lord Kant, Mr. Manad, Uncle Jocelyn." "Hello." Kant and Manad nodded in response. Then, Kant chuckled and said in a self-deprecating tone, "I only find out that your name is Jocelyn now." He looked at the leader of the trade caravan and said helplessly, "I have always liked to call you leader of the trade caravan. This is my profession, and I love it," Jocelyn replied with a smile. His answer was very clever and did not make Kant feel awkward. After all, Kant had a deep understanding of Mount and Blade in his previous life, to the point that he liked to use the title of his profession in the game to address Jocelyn. He also attributed the title, leader of the trade caravan, to him alone. It was not wrong to say that. Currently, Jocelyn was the only leader of the trade caravan. "I see." Jocelyn instructed the young man whom he admired the most, "Count the number of captives and feed the new captives some food and water. When the number reached 500, I will let you lead the team back to Rivaden. I won't let you down, Uncle Jocelyn." Joy was written all over the young man's face. "Go." Jocelyn waved his hand. "Yes, sir." The young guard immediately bowed respectfully and left. From his jubilant look, one could tell that he was very eager to lead his team back to Rivaden. "Your nephew." After he left, Manad smiled and said, "He looks a little too young." "Yes, he's already 17 years old, but he's still so easily agitated." The leader of the trade caravan nodded helplessly. He understood what Manad meant. He sighed and said, "Let him try this time. At least, with Lord Kant's reputation, not a single bandit gang on the continent of Karadia dares to rob the trade caravan from the land of miracles. This could be his training. It's always good for young people to get more training." Kant nodded. Although he was only 16 years old, he had lived for 2 lifetimes. Summing up the years he had lived, he was already over 40 years old. He could be considered as a middle-aged man. "I think so too." Jocelyn nodded, sighed, and said, "He is the son of my former comrade in arms. However, my comrade in arms died in the war with the Kirgit people. Before he died, he asked me to help look after his son. His son is pretty good. He is proficient in riding and swordsmanship. He has inherited his father's bravery. A brave father will never have a weak son." Kant nodded and comforted him. The atmosphere in the council hall was a little sad. Manad noticed that and switched the topic to business. As the most outstanding descendant of the Nord merchant family, he was completely able to control the situation during the conversation. The joyous atmosphere was back. Soon, the young man returned. Again, he bowed respectfully and reported to Kant and Jocelyn, "There are 322 Jack Allen captives. If they are purchased at 30 dinars each, the total value is 9,660 dinars. Close to 10,000 dinars." Kant raised his eyebrows slightly. Although he was already prepared, he was still shocked. Although most of the Jack Allens he killed along the way to the salt mine were in small numbers, there were more than 1,000 of them added together. Now that he thought about it, those that had been killed were not Jack Allens. They were 30,000 to 40,000 dinars. But they had been casually slaughtered and discarded in the desert. They had become worthless. Shaking his head slightly, Kant thought about the Jack Allens in the Sinway range. He couldn't help but lick the corner of his mouth. "It seems that I really need to set up a slave hunting team in the future." Manad nodded in agreement. "That's a good idea." Yet, Kant frowned. Perhaps this idea could be implemented. The current Oasis lookout was quite barren. The only commodity that could be produced on a large scale was probably salt. However, although salt was precious, Kant knew that there were restrictions. The system would not accept the materials produced in this world at all. In the end, the salt could only be traded with the merchants of this world. At most, it could be converted into silver coins and become Kant's capital so that he could rapidly establish a business circle with Oasis Lookout as its center. According to Kant and Manad's ideas, the most they could do was to wait for the economy of this world to be sufficiently developed and use silver coins to start purchasing gold that was allowed to be exchanged for dinars. However, this would not only be troublesome, but it would also easily cause turmoil in the already perfect financial world. This would then affect the business circle that Kant had established in this world, and the impact would be quite significant. The business was scaled. Exchanging silver coins for gold on a large scale would ultimately cause the price of gold to keep rising. The rise of gold price would also affect other businesses, such as economic exchanges between countries and commodities trading. This would then destroy the entire business structure, from top to bottom. In ancient times where there was no concept of business, the consequences of the collapse of the business chain were quite serious. Manad, remember the plan about the slave hunting team? Kant turned his head and looked at the Nord business genius he trusted the most. "Perhaps we should discuss it with Firentis tonight. I think this plan is feasible." "I agree." Manad nodded. At that time, the leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, had also finished counting the number of captives and the dinars that they would be paid. He pondered for a while and turned his head to report to Kant, "Lord Kant, currently you have captured 442 Jack Allens. If you can capture another 58 Jack Allens, then King Yarajek's entrustment will be completed." 58 more. Kant nodded and frowned. "That's very simple." The special quest arranged by King Yarajek of Viegirs had a final reward of 5 honor points. Kant was quite covetous of this. 5 honor points represented 5 chances to draw a lottery. He would never let this chance slip by. His fingers were tapping gently on the table. Kant ordered with a solemn expression, "Somebody, send my order to Firentis, and ask him to lead the Swadian cavalrymen to patrol the surroundings of the Oasis and get more Jack Allen captives back." "Yes, sir." The Swadian infantrymen, who were standing guard at the door, immediately answered. They were guards, but they were also messengers. They pushed open the thick wooden door and walked outside. Kant's order was conveyed and carried out. Many Jack Allens were hiding just behind the dune not far from the Oasis lookout. Some were run out and killed before, some escaped. These were the targets Kant planned to capture. Although the Swadian cavalrymen were not as efficient as the Sarandian horsemen, they were able to go deep into the desert. However, when patrolling at close range, these land tanks were extremely efficient. Furthermore, with Firentis leading them, it would not take long for them to complete the mission. Perhaps during dinner tonight, they would be able to capture a large number of Jack Allens. As long as they crushed those stubborn Jack Allens who resisted with their horses' hooves, the other jack-allans who were famished would definitely choose to surrender. This was really simple. Kant muttered to himself. On his retina, his current balance was shown. Balance, 15,614 dinars. The cost of the desert bandits' level up and the cost of building the canal had been taken into account. However, after selling the jack-allan captives twice and together with the balance from before, Kant's savings had increased to nearly 16,000 dinars. Basically, he had enough money for the construction of the stronghold this month and the expenses of the troops. Lord, we'll be heading out for the time being. The leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, bowed and left the council hall with his nephew. The trade caravan that was currently deployed in the grocery store still had important matters to deal with. Especially with so many captives, Jocelyn was not comfortable at letting his subordinates handle all of them. Okay. Kant nodded to indicate that he understood. Only he and Manad were still in the council hall. With a frown, Kant raised his head and told Manad beside him about his arrangements. In that case, arrange for some peasant men and women to boil the white salt as soon as possible tonight. You can set off tomorrow morning. Understood. Manad nodded. And the post house? Kant frowned and said to Manad, let 7 Swadian infantrymen and 10 desert bandits station there. If the Stone Pass wants to open up a trade route, tell them that our trading station is there. If they continue to go further, they will enter the Baron's private estate that is not open to the public. Understood. Manad nodded. These were the plans that they had already discussed. Knocking on the table, Kant was still a little worried. He looked up and said to Manad, put more charcoal when boiling the salt to absorb the impurities. I don't want my salt to be bitter. Or else, other than those serfs who have never eaten salt, it will become a joke that the noble loathes. Please rest assured. Manad solemnly guaranteed, this will not happen. Chapter 117, Completion of the Special Quest. Kant also expressed his approval after seeing his solemn expression. Whether or not he could use the refined white salt to open up the market of the Dukedom of Leo would depend on the first deal between Manad and Baron Dillon. If it went well, everything would go smoothly in the future. The stone pass that connected the Dukedom of Leo and the Naran Desert would become the shield of Oasis Lookout. But Kant did not think that this shield would be forever reliable. On the contrary, if he showed signs of weakness, this shield would not hesitate to retaliate. Baron Dillon, who was at the Stone Pass, could rise from an ordinary cavalryman from a foreign country to a baron of the Dukedom of Leo in just 20 years. He was not a stupid man who only rely on battle achievements, because that was unrealistic. However, Kant did not care. He dared to join forces with Baron Dillon, although it was like asking for a tiger for his skin. He was confident. As long as Baron Dillon could help him block most of the attention and malice in the early stage and allow Kant to survive in the Oasis Lookout, which was still weak. When the Oasis Lookout eventually became strong enough and could protect itself, the shield's job was done. And when that time came, even if Baron Dillon did not want to continue being a shield, it was not up to him. There were no urgent matters to be dealt with at the moment. Manad got up and walked out of the council hall to start preparing for tonight's salt-making work. Kant gave up the authority completely. The salt-making technique was not difficult. The Sarandian people had already told Manad to find a few strong peasant men and women. The sugar-making workshop close to the city wall was temporarily used as a salt-making workshop. The peasant men and women were busy. Sacks of coarse salt were piled at the door. Nearly 40 sacks were piled up into a half-a-meter-high city wall, taking up half of the street. Charcoal, firewood, and oil for ignition were also prepared. The 2 stoves in the sugar workshop were also cleaned and stuffed with firewood and charcoal. They were sprinkled with oil and ignited. Black smoke was released into the air from the chimney on the roof. There were no clouds and no wind. A stream of black smoke rose into the sky. It was quite eye-catching in the Naran Desert. It could be seen clearly from a distance that would take half a day to reach. It was like a warning smoke or a signal to mark the location of the Oasis lookout. There were gains and losses. The large-scale salt or sugar refining, because of the use of large amounts of charcoal and firewood, produced thick black smoke. It was like telling everyone that this was the Oasis lookout that produced sugar and salt. At the same time, it would also let malicious people know the exact location of the Oasis lookout. But it didn't matter. Anyone could easily find the Oasis lookout. Within the dukedom of Leo, there was still a map that marked the route from the stone pass to the Oasis lookout. Otherwise, Kant wouldn't have dared to venture deep into the Naran desert with just a few men. Perhaps the expedition army of the Grey Mane Kingdom would be able to capture a few low-level Jack Allens and let these true natives lead the way. Although this world did not have GPS, those experienced leaders in the army could still find the right path with the stars and the sun, as well as many geographical details that ordinary people did not care about. Kant was beginning to learn the skills, so he knew how that would work. Compared to the returns and benefits obtained from refining salt, these were all small problems that could be ignored. The salt refining process continued. If there were no limitations on charcoal and firewood, Kant would even increase the scale of salt refining. However, tomorrow morning, the refined white salt would enter the stone pass. On the return trip, he would use his connections with Baron Dillon to buy a large amount of grain, charcoal, and iron tools. When Kant first arrived, he had prepared 6 horses and 3 carriages. They would return with these materials, solving the problems in the Oasis lookout, forming a virtuous cycle brought about by trade exchanges. In the sugar workshop, the speed of salt refining was also increasing. Sacks of coarse salt and spring water were poured into the iron pot. As the temperature rose, the salt quickly dissolved and turned into salt water. Firewood was added up to the bottom of the pot. The salt water began to bubble and boil, and an extremely ugly grey foam appeared on the boiling water. These were all impurities in coarse salt. Various substances left behind when the salt-alkali land dried up were the main reason why the coarse salt was so bitter that it could not be eaten. It may even be poisonous and cause diarrhea. The peasant women would deal with this. They carefully skimmed the foam off and scooped it up the foam with a spoon. After the salt water was slightly clearer, they poured it into a wooden bucket. Charcoal was placed neatly in the bucket. The water with a very high salt content was poured into the bucket, leaving only the last layer at the bottom. It was all grey and sticky to the touch. It was either soil, sand, or heavy metal residues, which were impurities that could not be absorbed by the human body. After sinking to the bottom, they would end up like the foam. It was poured into another wooden bucket and would be discarded later. Then, the iron pot would be cleaned and the above steps would be repeated. The salt water that had been refined with these steps could already be consumed right away. Although the taste was still slightly bitter, ordinary people would not care. Most of the salt was consumed by the noble families. Next in line were the wealthy citizens in the cities who had decent jobs. They would still buy the salt although it was expensive and consume it during certain festivals. The peasants in the countryside, the serfs who did not have freedom, did not belong to the group of salt consumers. If Kant was willing to sell these slightly bitter salt at a low price, it would be welcomed by most people. This was because this salt, which could even be afforded by the peasants in the countryside, would become a windfall that swept across the entire country. Although the price was low, the quantity was large. It was just like the salt industry of an ancient country, it was monopolized. While making salt affordable to ordinary people, they would also make a profit through quantity. But Kant would not adopt such a trade plan. Or rather, why would he want to turn the expensive salt, a luxury product that only noble families could afford, a commodity that was as precious as spices, into a common condiment that even ordinary people could afford to eat? Kant had control over the source of salt production. But he was not the only one who produced salt. The distant dwarf kingdom also produced salt. The dukedom of Leo already had merchants who used this as a means to make a fortune. They basically relied on this, and they would not let others interfere. This was also why Kant would give the vast majority of the profits to Baron Dillon. Kant let Baron Dillon attract the firepower of those who once had a vested interest to win time for himself. On the other hand, completely breaking the rules of the salt industry by turning salt into a condiment that both the peasants and the serfs could afford to eat would completely trigger the conflict. It would no longer be a commercial competition. Instead, it would be like subverting a culture. It would be so serious that it would cause a huge protest in the entire dukedom of Leo. Those high and mighty noble families would never allow it. The lowly peasants would never be allowed to eat the same salt, even if it looked similar but actually tasted bitter. This was an extremely strict social system. Bloodline determined everything. If Kant changed this, even if it was just a symbolic thing, the consequences were not something he could bear at the moment. This was his concern. But Kant did not want to change this, because high-grade fine white salt was a rare luxury item that only appeared in noble banquets. The selling price was very profiteering, and it allowed him to quickly accumulate power. Even if he shared most of the profits with Baron Dillon, the return would still be generous. Because he controlled the salt mine. Just like now. After the impurities had been filtered by the charcoal, the remaining salt water was poured into another iron pot. As the firewood burned and the flame licked the bottom of the pot, the water quickly evaporated, and the remaining salt liquid became thicker and thicker. Eventually, the crystallized white salt began to form and adhere to the bottom of the pot. It was as white as snow and extremely beautiful. The peasant women immediately used wooden shovels to take the salt out and put it in specially prepared gunny sacks. However, the amount of refined white salt was much less. Usually, a bag of coarse salt would be dissolved and filtered, and then the white salt would form. In the end, it would only fill up half a bag. Almost half of the salt would be lost. However, thanks to the vast difference between their prices, even if more than half of the salt was lost, the remaining half a bag of white salt would be worth 40 bags of coarse salt. This was hundreds of times more profit. The appearance of the first finished product encouraged these peasant women and men. They began to speed up and become more and more skilled. By the look of their excitement, Kant knew that by tomorrow morning, these 40 bags of coarse salt would definitely be successfully refined and turned into fine white salt that was expensive but loved by the nobles. With Manet's supervision, efficiency was guaranteed. Kant was relieved. Now, he still had another important matter to deal with. Phyrontus had already brought his team back. Behind the 50 Swadian heavy cavalrymen, there were over 100 Jack Allen captives with dirt-covered faces and blood-stains on their bodies. Looking at their fearful expressions, one could tell that they had already experienced how terrifying the heavy cavalry could be. Without hesitation, Kant ordered Phyrontus and the leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, to quickly go to the council hall. Emergency notification. Once Jocelyn completed his inspection and officially purchased the 100 Jack Allen captives, they would then have a total of 500 captives. The special quest from the kingdom of Viegers could be announced as complete. And the 5 honor points would officially belong to Kant. Thinking about the big gift pack he could get from the lucky draw, Kant couldn't wait any longer. Lord Kant. Phyrontus and Jocelyn walked into the council hall and bowed respectfully to Kant. Well done. Kant nodded to Phyrontus with a smile on his face. However, he turned to look at the leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, and said directly, "You've checked, right? I think with these captives, together with the ones captured previously, there should be 500 people, right?" "Yes, Lord Kant." Jocelyn nodded and reported, "This time, there are a total of 103 captives, which is equivalent to 3,090 dinars. After a pause, he continued, "In total, there are now 572 captives, the requirements of the quest are fulfilled." "That's good," Kant chuckled. Chapter 118, Kant's 5 Draw. There was no doubt about Phyrontus's ability. This time, they captured 103 Jack Allen captives, and it was another 3,090 dinars. The crisp sound of metal coins colliding was really pleasing to the ears. Kant's smiley face became more brilliant. Looking up at the leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, Kant smiled and said, "Then my mission should be completed." "Of course, it has been completed, and it is quite outstanding." Jocelyn stood up, put his hands on his chest, and bent down. Using the most solemn etiquette of the Voyageurs, he answered respectfully, "Please allow me to express my most respectful gratitude to you on behalf of King Yarajek. The 545 Jack Allen captives you sold us are the beginning of our good cooperation from now on." Kant raised his eyebrows slightly. "Will the Kingdom of Voyageurs also purchase these Jack Allen captives on a large scale in the future?" "Of course," Jocelyn nodded affirmatively. "There is never too much of Snowfield mine." "That's good," Kant chuckled. Since the iron mine on the snowfield of Voyageurs was so enthusiastic on the demand the Jack Allen captives, then he would not hesitated. In order to fight for the dominance of the Naran Desert and the lumber of the Sinway Range, Kant would needed to have a fierce conflict with this primitive and savage race. Now, he could made money at the price of 30 dinar for a Jack Allen captive. It was just like recycling trashes. He could kill them if he wanted to, but now he could exchange the captives for money. It was a no-cost business. On his retina, a dialog box instantly popped up. "Ding, after your unremitting efforts, the mission has been completed. Special quest, the Kingdom of Voyageurs' mission has been completed. Reward, honor ×5. Introduction, the Kingdom of Voyageurs, which is rich in iron ores, is difficult to excavate because the iron ores are located in the snowy plains. Now, you have provided more than 500 Jack Allen slaves to help the Kingdom of Voyageurs solve this difficult problem. Many mine owners and noble families express their gratitude to you, and hope to maintain a good slave trade with you." The dialog box showed that the mission was completed. Kant's coveted 5 honor points were obtained immediately. In his opinion, this was the most useful thing in the system reward, especially when combined with the system mall's lucky draw. If he was lucky enough to get a good item, it would be a huge profit. However, the system dialog box had not ended yet. Ding, system prompt. "You have obtained the friendship of the Kingdom of Voyageurs. Additional reward, reputation ×1000. Kant was slightly stunned by this. His eyes swept across the dialog box on his retina. Kant subconsciously swallowed his saliva. He was a little puzzled. Obtained the friendship of the Kingdom of Voyageurs. This system prompt was a little vague. The system did not have a detailed prompt on what the friendship of the Kingdom of Voyageurs really meant. "My lord." The leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, bowed slightly. "If possible, I would like to assist my nephew in arranging the carriage back home. You know, this will be his first time leading a trade caravan. I have many important details to explain to him." "Of course, this is what I should do." Kant came back to his senses and nodded in agreement. "Thank you for your kindness." Jocelyn bowed and walked out of the council hall. Jocelyn, the leader of the trade caravan, was very attentive to his nephew. He busied himself as if he was his own son. Kant nodded and praised, "He is a good guy. He is worthy of being a reliable comrade." Phyrantus also agreed. However, Phyrantus still stood up and said to Kant, "Lord, if there is nothing else here, I will go and patrol the city walls. It is close to night, I am afraid that something will happen." "Yes, arrange the soldiers on night duty," Kant nodded. "Understood," Phyrantus replied and also strode out of the council hall. Only Kant was left on the long table. Turning his head to look at the empty council hall, there were only a few guards and peasant women waiting. Kant stood up and casually ordered, "Don't wait for me at dinner, I will come down myself." "Understood, my lord," the peasant women immediately nodded. The appetizing smell of cooking food had begun to spread. The aroma of frying and barbecuing could be smelled coming from the narrow hole in the council hall. It was almost dinner time. Although he was a little hungry, Kant did not care. He quickly walked towards the stairs and entered his room on the 3rd floor. He lied on the soft and comfortable bed with velvet cushions and closed his eyes. System, enter the system mall to draw the lottery. Kant's mind connected directly to the system and went straight to the point. This was what he was most concerned about. Ding, system mall is ready. As Kant's mind communicated with the system, a dialog box appeared on his retina. The colorful treasure chest was in the middle, and a faint colorful light was glimmering within. It seemed to be waiting for the moment to be opened, and it would bloomed with an unbelievable surprise. Begin the lottery draw. Taking a deep breath, Kant didn't hesitate. Moreover, his tone was quite certain, and he directly chose, proceed with the 5 draw. Although it was a 5 draw, and there wasn't an additional reward of 10 draw, Kant couldn't wait for too long. What he wanted was a 5 draw, and without any hesitation. Ding, system lottery draw begins. The dialog box popped up. The treasure chest slowly opened, and the colorful light became even more dazzling. And at the moment it was fully opened, dialog box after dialog box popped up on Kant's retina, indicating the grand prizes of the 5 draws. Ding, you have acquired the troop class pack. You have opened the troop class pack and found out that it was Viegier's Archers X50 from the Kingdom of Viegier's. A wonderful beginning. Kant's lips curled up slightly. Viegier's Archer, level 4 troop class, the main long-range archer that's second only to Viegier's Marksman. The system dialog box then popped up. Ding, you have acquired the troop class pack. You have opened the troop class pack and found out that it was Swadian Crossbowman Kingdom of Swadia. This time, Kant was slightly stunned. Unexpectedly, another troop class pack had appeared. And it was also a level 4 troop class. It was the Kingdom of Swadia's main long-range attack force, the Swadian Crossbowmen. Kant's eyes were bright. He was looking forward to the next pack. Ding, you have acquired the construction pack. You have opened the construction pack and discovered that it is the Arrow Tower X4. The system dialog box popped up. Unexpectedly, the construction pack was actually the Arrow Tower that was completely compatible with the troop class pack. And there were 4 of it. Before Kant could be more surprised, the dialog box then popped up on his retina. The 4th one. Ding, you have acquired the construction pack. You have opened the construction pack and discovered that it was City Wall Attic, increased height. It was still the construction pack. However, Kant frowned slightly. He had never heard of this building he obtained in the original version. Soon after, the dialog box for the lucky draw appeared again. It was the last one. Ding, you have acquired the item pack. You have the item pack and found out that it was ammunition reloading spell X 3 times. All 5 consecutive draws had ended. There was no additional reward. Kant had already understood it in his heart. He did not feel any regret. Instead, he frowned slightly. All the items that he had obtained from this draw appeared on his retina. His heartbeat was beating fast. This time his system's draw still yielded a bountiful prizes. All of these were things that Kant urgently needed or could use. 50 Viegier's Archers, 50 Swadian Crossbowmen. Kant swallowed his saliva. His gaze swept across the other gift packs as he silently said, 4 Arrow Towers, City Walls Attics. His tone was a little surprised, and 3 rounds of ammunition reloading. These were the results of the lucky draw. It was a completely defensive-oriented reward. Or rather, it was a long-range firepower-oriented reward. The 2 troop class pack was the most obvious indication. 50 Viegier's Archers and 50 Swadian Crossbowmen were all archers. When these 100 long-range attackers joined Oasis Lookout, it immediately alleviated the current situation of relying on only 20 Ravenstone Rangers. Their long-ranged attack density was very low. There were still 4 arrow towers. As long as they were placed around the walls of Trondheim Fortress, with the standards of these level 4 and level 5 archers, it would be no problem for their firepower to cover a distance of 200 meters from a high point. Moreover, there was also the ammunition reloading spell for 3 times. This made Kant think of the magic spell of the fantasy mod, Wind of War, New Era. When the archers did not have enough ammunition, they could automatically reload it. It was quite a practical spell. Slightly clenching his fist, Kant nodded in satisfaction. The lucky draw this time was really good. The expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane was already within reach. Their firepower output was extremely weak. These buildings and troop class completely made up for the weakness of Kant's troop class. Moreover, with the 3 rounds of ammunition reloading, their firepower became even more durable. If those Jack Allen dared to attack, Kant would not hesitate to have his archers unleash all their firepower. The rain of arrows was one of the effective ways to stop the siege. Perhaps, I'll need to purchase a large number of arrows to go to the stone pass, Kant made up his mind. If Kant's guess was correct, every Viegier's archers should have a quiver, which could hold more than 30 arrows. The Swadian crossbowmen were about the same. They were equipped with a quiver and more than 30 arrows. Even with 3 rounds of ammunition reloading, they could only increase their firepower by 3 times. 90 arrows per person was not a lot in a city defense battle. In other words, there were only 9,000 arrows per 100 people, it was still very little. Therefore, they also needed to purchase military supplies at the stone pass to replenish their supplies. Although Kant's buildings had a weapons workshop that could produce arrows and crossbows, they lacked wood, iron, feathers, and other raw materials. They also lacked blacksmiths, fletchers, and other professional craftsmen. It was impossible to manufacture the arrows and crossbows. They could only buy these items. Considering the benefits of cooperating with Baron Dillon, Kant was certain that this cunning Baron would agree. Baron Dillon did not know that the Jack Allen tribe in the Naran Desert had basically been wiped out. If he lost Kant, a partner who could provide a large amount of salt, and he could not directly lead the troops into the Oasis. Before he could personally seize the salt mines, he would get endless of military supplies. Chapter 119, The New Situation Before the Banquet. The evening gradually came to an end. The glittering stars accompanied the moon, dazzling their own light in the sky. It was like a soft gauze falling on the ground, brought upon the gender night. The wooden stick was wrapped in linen strips and soaked with oil. The Swadian light footmen of the patrol team made some simple torches and held it in their hands. They were patrolling along the outer dune of the Oasis lookout before nightfall. On the streets within the city walls, the same torches were lit and inserted into the specially made notches on both sides of the walls. The torches were brightly lit, as if it were daytime. The entire street was clearly visible. This made it easier for the busy peasants and peasant women to get busy with their work. Tables and chairs were moved out of the house. At the same time, wooden bowls and plates, as well as knives, forks, and spoons, were prepared. The rich aroma of food permeated the air. 10 roasted golden sand gazelle were brought to the table, including sliced bread in small wicker baskets, and white salt sprinkled with a little spice on the wooden plates. And there were tubs of cabbage soup, it was steaming hot and had a tempting smell. It was time for dinner. And it was a feast specially prepared to celebrate the victory. There was also that fascinating malt liquor. It was all goods from the Rivaden trade caravan. For tonight's banquet and to celebrate the successful establishment of the fortress, including the launch of the table salt trade, Manad took the initiative to purchase 10 barrels of malt liquor. Although the price was slightly expensive, which reaching to 250 dinars per barrel, it had a very good relaxing effect for those who had been busy for a long time, like the soldiers and civilians who were stressed out. Manad had already reported it, and Kant also agreed. It was already soaked in the cold spring water, and it could be pulled up and opened when the meal began. Taking a sip of the amber-colored liquor, the slight malt sweetness spread in his mouth along with the coolness. He swallowed it in one gulp and let out a satisfied burp. Before the satisfaction feeling gone, he used a small knife to cut a piece of roasted golden lamb, dipped it in salt, and put it in his mouth. It was very delicious. Just thinking about it could made one's felt like their mouth and stomach were going to explode tonight. Everyone's faces were filled with joy. Food and wine, the eternal rule of all things. The soldiers who were off duty also came over to help. The malt liquors that were cold in the spring water were all scooped up and placed neatly beside the long table. The wet wine barrels had yet to be wiped clean, and a circle of water had soaked the sand and soil under their feet. They could not wait to taste the liquor. No one could refuse the amber-like liquor flowed down their throats. It was refreshing and addicting. However, Lord Kant, their lord, had yet to come down, so no one would really drank the malt liquor, even if it was just a sip. This was respect for the worthy lord from the bottom of their hearts. After patrolling, the Swadian footmen returned with torches. After confirming that there were no problems, they exchanged duties with their companions, put down the burden of a busy day, and walked toward the streets in groups of 3 or 5. The light footmen who took over the duties stood at the city gates or the city walls as sentries. At night, they just needed to carefully guard the city walls and the key points. However, there were still elite Swadian footmen wearing heavy armor to form a patrol team to patrol the interior of the fortress. The patrol was loose on the outside but tight on the inside. Safety was the first priority. Everyone was waiting for orders on both sides of the street. Those who were familiar with each other sat together, chatting about interesting stories from the past. From time to time, they even laughed out loud. The atmosphere was very lively. The banquet was about to begin. As the host, Manad stood at the chair of the long table and nodded to himself when he saw the lively atmosphere. From the looks of it, this banquet was already halfway to success. Has Lord Kant not come down yet? After Phirantus had arranged for the night sentries and patrols, he quickly walked over. However, he did not saw Kant. He could not help but turned his head to look at the towering council hall at the side. He said to Manad somewhat helplessly, "Didn't anyone call for Lord Kant?" Perhaps he fell asleep because he was too tired. No, Manad was also helpless. Lord Kant told me not to call for him for dinner. But, this banquet might be disappointing without Lord Kant. Phirantus was slightly stunned, then shook his head and smiled bitterly. This was a celebration banquet. Currently, Oasis Lookout had held the largest banquet. Roasted sheep, roasted meat, dried sausage, and all kinds of food were piled on the table. There was also cabbage soup and malt liquor. They were all quite luxurious food. In order to successfully host the banquet tonight, many spices were added to the food. For the current Oasis Lookout, this was equivalent to sumptuous banquet condiment. But now, Lord Kant didn't showed up. The owner of Oasis Lookout, the Lord of Trondheim Fortress, he had to show up at the banquet. Wait! Phirantus's pupils shrank. He turned to look at the corner at the edge of the city wall and said in astonishment, "I don't remember there being that's." What? Manad also turned to look. The soldiers who were still chatting had also noticed something. They all stood up and looked around with widened eyes, as if they had discovered something. However, their eyes were filled with joy. "Is that the arrow tower?" Phirantus's voice burst out, and his tone was full of surprise. "There are also city walls attics." "That's right," Manad nodded in agreement. Everyone inside and outside of the fortress nodded in affirmation, especially the Swadian people, who were even more surprised. The arrow tower that was made entirely of stone, as well as the city wall attics were made of solid wood, had a strong style of the kingdom of Swadia. How could these Swashtian soldiers not reminisced and touched? This is Lord Kant's miracle. Manad opened his mouth, everyone at the banquet cheered up instantly. In their impression, this was a supreme power that only a god could achieve. And they also knew it. Lord Kant, the Lord who followed by those in the land of miracles, could also do it. Everyone's faces were filled with joy and smiles. The appearance of these buildings represented the rise of the city defense system once again, and it was a guarantee of their safety. Especially the peasant and peasant women, they were so excited that they wept. This meant that they had a chance to survive. Under the enemy's attack, they had the strength to fight back. In the rectangular fortress, arrow towers appeared on all four corners. The height of the tower was 10 meters, which was the same as the council hall. The width of the tower was 5 meters, and it was divided into 3 levels. At least 30 archers could be stationed there. It was like a giant covered with thorns, guarding the fortress with its chest out. The stone wall, which had only a concave and convex arrow-blocking wall, had changed greatly. The most eye-catching part was its height. The stone wall, which was 5 meters tall, had become 7 meters tall. The attic was made of wood, it was 2 meters tall. Not only did it increase the height of the wall, but it could also block the wind and rain, and even blocked the rain of arrows from the sky. This was the attic where the archers were stationed. It really was developed from the normal attic where the people lived. It not only improved the survival of the archers. When the war had not started, it could be used as a resting place for the archers, and they could guard their posts day and night. If the war came, these archers pushed open the window like shooting holes, and they could turn this attic, which was usually blocked the wind and rain, into a giant beast of death that spewed countless arrows. They could let the attacking troops know what the anger of the city defenders was. Woo! The sound of an alarm horn suddenly sounded from the top of the council hall. The Ravenstern Ranger stuck his head out from above the wall, pointed to the east and shouted loudly, "An unidentified army is approaching." What? Phyrontis was slightly stunned, and there was still some doubt on his face. But he immediately clenched his fists and shouted to the surrounding soldiers, "Everyone, get into battle status. Immediately set up a defense on the city wall. Before receiving new orders, maintain the defense on the city wall." Understood, the soldiers on the streets who were still waiting for the banquet to begin roared in unison. Everyone's expressions were death serious. This was because the unidentified troops were still heading towards the Oasis lookout. At the moment, all they could thought of was that the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane from the Mannheim coast was here to conquer their enemy troops. Wait, it doesn't seem to be the enemy. At the top of the council hall, the Ravenstern Ranger stuck his head out and shouted. Looking at his comrades who were ready for battle, the ranger looked a little embarrassed, but he still shouted at them, "It seems to be the troops of the Kingdom of Vaigirs and the Kingdom of Swadia. Send someone out to take a look." The soldiers who were rushing towards the city wall subconsciously stopped in their tracks. The Kingdom of Vaigirs and the Kingdom of Swadia? The leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, was stunned. He was a Vaigirs. Phyrontis frowned. He reprimanded the ranger, "Are you sure?" "Yes." The ranger replied apologetically, "Sorry, I didn't make it clear." "Make it clear next time," Phyrontis snorted. But he didn't continue reprimanding him. He turned to the soldiers around him and ordered again, "Disarm the alarm and send a few light footmen to investigate. If it's the troops of the Kingdom of Vaigirs and the Kingdom of Swadia, bring them here. To be able to come to the Land of Miracles means that they are brave warriors who are willing to follow Lord Kant and help us." "Yes," the 4 elite desert bandit replied and quickly ran to the stable. After finding their own desert horses, they untied the reins and mounted the horse. They immediately ran out of the city gate and headed towards the dune on the east side. Right behind the dune, a 100-man army was walking in an orderly formation. Other than the little noises of stepping on the sand layer and pulling out the sand, the entire army was silent. They only walked towards the direction of the Oasis lookout. Although the formation was tight, these 100 people were clearly divided. 50 people were Vaigirs archers. And another 50 people were Swadian crossbowmen. Chapter 120, Soldiers in High Spirits. 4 desert bandits galloped on their horses and soon appeared at the top of the sand dunes. Holding the desert horses in their legs, they looked ahead, cold sweat instantly dripping down their temples. The hand holding the reins slowly lifted the hilt of the knife on their waist, but without any impulse. They swallowed saliva and rode their horses quietly on the top of the dunes. Out of the dunes below, within a range of nearly 100 meters, hundreds of archers had lined up. Arrows and crossbows had also aimed at them now. Although they had not drawn their bows and pulled the trigger, these fierce men who fought over the battlefield knew that if they showed any hostility or pulled out their machetes to charge, in less than a second a shower of arrows would cover the top of the dunes where the four of them were, completely turning them into real hedgehogs with arrows or crossbows. The indifferent eyes of the hundreds of archers were fixed on the four of them. The slightest movement would make a shower of arrows. Even turned around to escape they wouldn't, nor would they dare run away. The speed of four-legged desert horses was indeed fast, but they were nowhere near as fast as a shower of arrows that could fly through the air. Moreover, there still had a mission. "Don't be impulse," the chief desert bandit spoke slowly. And his hand, quite slowly, loosened from the hilt of the knife at his waist, and retightening the reins, he tapped the horse belly lightly to give it 2 steps forward, and he said, "This is the fief of Lord Kant, strange troops from the kingdom of Virginia and Swadia, tell me your intentions." His words seemed to have worked. The long bows and crossbows that were aimed at them initially were all lowered, and also showed their goodwill. This was a slight relief to the 4 desert bandits. It seemed really not the enemies. And among the 100 people, 2 of them looked at each other and seemed to be the leaders. They came out at the same time, put down their weapons completely and spoke in unison. "We are 50 crossbowmen from the kingdom of Swadia, came to following Kant's honor. We are 50 archers from the kingdom of Virginia, came to following Kant's honor." These words officially identified them. The 4 elite desert bandits completely relaxed, shaking their reins and walking down the dunes, a smile and a nod to them. "We are here to greet you, our new friends from Swadia and Virginia. Welcome to the land of miracles. If not enemies, then friends." Both sides put away their weapons. After all, they knew the Sarandan people well enough. Soon, the elite desert bandit took them back to the sentry Oasis. The Swadian light infantry, who was standing guard at the city gate, smiled at them and, without hesitation, directly asked the gate to be opened and let in all these archers. "Both are the same arms of the kingdom of Swadia," a look could tell true or false. "Welcome." Phardis also came outside the street to greet them. Looking at these energetic archers, he nodded with satisfaction, "Your arrival, so that our defense system can finally come into use." Shrugging slightly, he pointed with a smile at the rampart attics and arrow towers. "Without you archers and crossbowmen, our fortifications would be useless." "Glad we could help," the crossbowman replied humbly. The atmosphere became very harmonious. The crossbowmen from the kingdom of Virginia and Swadia had also heard of the tales of Phardis. This former wandering knight was one of the few nobles on the continent. Many lords wanted to enlist this knight with noble blood who had honed himself while wandering, but for reasons of ideological Phardis did not accept the title and instead came to the land of miracles to serve Lord Kant. And for all of us, this was the highest honor. The banquet continued. More chairs and tables were moved out, and the sounds of welcoming new friends rang out. The leader of the caravan from Rivaden, Jocelyn, was also entrusted by Manide to help greet the newly arrived Virginia archers, and they chatted with each other, which made the atmosphere more lively and cheerful. There was no such thing as a tense, war-ready atmosphere. In fact, that was a misunderstanding. Dang dang dang! There was a knock on Kant's door. "Lord Kant, I hope it didn't disturb your rest." Manide stood outside the door, heard a voice from inside and whispered, "The banquet is about to begin, and just now 50 archers from the kingdom of Swadia and 50 crossbowmen from the kingdom of Swadia came here to follow you." Inside of the room, Kant opened his eyes in a daze. There was no candles lit in the room, so it was relatively dark. Through the narrow opening of the window, he saw a blaze of stars and a seemingly frozen darkness. "Oh, I fell asleep." Kant's sleepy eyes burst open and his mind was suddenly awake. Only then did he realize that his mind had risen to the sky at the time, and after opening the perspective of God to build the building, he actually fell asleep on the bed groggy and only woke up when Manide came knocking at the door. "Lord Kant." Outside the door, Manide tapped twice more. "Yeah, I heard that," Kant replied. Fortunately, he had not taken off his clothes. He stood up, stretched, went to open the door and saw Manide with a wry smile. "This is a mistake worth remembering. I actually fell asleep. It is a result of fatigue." Manide bowed slightly, stepped half back and looked at Kant. "Lord, the banquet will begin soon. We are going." Kant led the way. Manide hurried to follow. Candles were lit in the stairs of the ruling chamber, so there was plenty of light. Kant walked down the stairs quickly and came to the outside of the ruling chamber. The torches were burning, releasing more light, and the whole street was as bright as a day. Kant stepped out of the dim hall, his eyes even a little unable to adjust, and he couldn't help narrowing his eyes and stood there for a second or two. But in the street just ahead, the soldiers, who had been bragging and laughing, burst into cheers. "Good evening, praiseworthy Lord Kant." "Good health, my lord." "Great Lord Kant, how excited to see you." They all looked at Kant enthusiastically with the most fervent reverence, and even when they looked at the king of their own country, they did not have such fanatical and reverent gazes, as if they were looking at the only faith and reliance of the world and the spirit. This was the constant loyalty from the system. There was also the legend of miracles that Kant circulated in Kaladaya. "Hello." Kant nodded and reached out to respond. With a smile on his face, he walked to his main seat and sat down. "Sit down, all of you, and make this banquet lively." And at the same time to Manide and Fhardus, and our new friends. "I hope there is enough food." "Enough." Manide nodded affirmatively. In the kitchen, the new desert antelope had been dragged out and roasted. Although 100 more people there, the number was definitely enough. The desert antelope, which appeared at the end of each month, was a rich source of prey. "Let's start." Kant held out his hand to signal the banquet to begin. Cheers immediately were emitted from the mouths of the soldiers, farmers, and peasant women. The sound of wolfing down food also appeared. Roasted mutton and dried meat, sausage, bread, and other items on the long table in front of them were torn into pieces by the hungry men. At the same time, the lid of the malt liquor was lifted. A bowl per person. Not much or even drunk, but limited each person 1 bowl of malt liquor, just to be on the safe side. No one was allowed to drink more. Even Kant led by example, downing his bowl and not continue to drink these paralyzing drinks and refraining from drinking anything too alcoholic, for safety's sake. Danger lingered on his side, and only fools would celebrate. It was a lively banquet. But it was also a yearning for a better life in the future. Want to eat this delicious every day. In addition to hard work, there was endless cruel fights. Holding a piece of roasted and charred lamb in his knife, Kant dipped it in salt sprinkled with crushed spices. It tasted good after his mouth, and the feeling of the oil soaking in the salt and spices and melting in his mouth made him breathe out after swallowing. It was a delicacy, and he loved it. The banquet ended in excitement. The peasant women cleaned up a mess of tables, chairs, and the floors. He did not want his oasis to turn into the grubby look of the stone pass, which was unacceptable to him coming from a modern age, not to mention the poor sanitation would cause a plague. The oasis was the only concentration of deserts. If there was a plague, there would be no hiding in such a small place. Hygiene, therefore, had always been a key issue for Kant. Fadus continued to patrol the city wall before going to sleep. Manide supervised the salting work. And after the banquet, the leader of the caravan, Jocelyn, stood at the city gate. Not far away was his nephew and his entourage of 12 sentries. 3 carriages took the lead in the return journey, returning the more than 500 Jack Allen slaves that Kant had captured back to Revaden. It's going well. Kant stood at the top of the ruling chamber, next to the 20 rangers of Ravenstone. Smiling slightly, he exhorted the rangers, I've got Virginia and Swadia archers to be stationed in the attic and arrow towers of the city wall, but your task is still arduous. We will be vigilant, the rangers answered firmly. Very good. Kant nodded. These rangers, after all, were Tier 5. Although it looked like it was only one level away from Tier 4, actually they were worlds apart. With these rangers stationed at the top of the ruling chamber, Kant slept soundly. He walked down the stairs. Kant returned to his room. Looking at the dark night outside the window, he lay on his bed and thought, tomorrow is the day of the caravan's departure, this week can be sorted out all the trivial matters. Just wait quietly for the expeditionary army from the Greymane Kingdom to arrive. He frowned slightly. There was a grim smile on Kant's lips. He still had the confidence to win and obtain the hegemony of the Naran Desert.